Welcome to Moonlit Inc. BL. A BL story written under moonlight. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Booking of the Year. I don't care if the lilies have to be flown in from the Netherlands on a private jet, Eddie. If the bride wants a winter wonderland in the middle of a July heatwave, you make it snow. Eddie Morris didn't even look up from his tablet. He adjusted his glasses, his thumb scrolling through a digital floor plan with practiced ease. Mrs. Gable, if I make it snow in July, your guests will be slipping on slush by the hors d'oeuvres. We'll use Silk Touch synthetics and internal cooling units. It'll look like the Alps and feel like a crisp October morning. Trust me. The woman on the other end of the line sighed, a sound of pure relief. This is why you're the best. I'll see you at the rehearsal. Eddie clicked the end call button and finally let out a breath, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Around him, the Morris and Company headquarters was a whirlwind of organized chaos. Assistants were darting between mood boards, fabric swatches lined the mahogany tables, and the faint scent of expensive espresso permeated the air. He had built this from nothing, from a scrappy kid with a sketchbook to the man who dictated the aesthetics of the country's elite. Eddie? You have a 10 a.m., Sarah, his lead coordinator, murmured as she leaned into his glass-walled office. She looked uncharacteristically tense, her fingers twisting a pen. It's a walk-in, but they have the black card clearance. And the name. Eddie straightened his tie, the silk smooth against his throat. Who is it? The governor's daughter again? No, Sarah said, stepping aside. It's the Ambrose Summers party. Eddie's heart didn't just skip a beat, it hit a wall. He kept his face a mask of granite, but his pulse began to thrum a frantic rhythm against his collar. He knew that name. He knew it in the way you know a scar that only aches when the weather changes. The glass door swung open, and the atmosphere in the room shifted. It became colder, more expensive. Everett Ambrose walked in first. He looked exactly the same, yet entirely different. The soft, boyish edges of the college student Eddie had loved were gone, replaced by the sharp, lethal angles of a CEO. His suit was charcoal, bespoke, and probably cost more than Eddie's first car. Behind him was a man Eddie recognized from the business journals, Colton Summers. He was tall, blond, and possessed the kind of arrogance that came from being born into a logistics empire. Everett stopped dead in his tracks. His gaze locked onto Eddie's, and for a split second, the polished mask of the Ambrose heir cracked. His eyes widened, a flash of genuine, raw shock reeling through them. Eddie? Everett's voice was a low rasp, a ghost of a sound. Eddie didn't flinch. He didn't let his hands shake. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his vest, and offered a practiced, professional smile, the kind he gave to strangers who were about to write him a six-figure check. Mr. Ambrose, Eddie said, his voice as crisp as a fresh invitation. And Mr. Summers. Welcome to Morris and Company. I understand you have a wedding to plan. Colton stepped forward, sliding a possessive hand onto Everett's shoulder. He didn't notice the tension vibrating between the two men, he was too busy looking around the office with an air of appraisal. So you're the Morris everyone raves about? My mother said if we didn't get you, the wedding wouldn't be worth the paper the invites are printed on. Everett hadn't moved. He was staring at Eddie as if he were seeing a dead man walking. You're the owner. You're the Eddie Morris. I am, Eddie replied, gesturing toward the velvet chairs in front of his desk. A lot can happen in a year, Everett. People grow. Businesses flourish. He sat back down, picking up a gold-plated pen. Now, shall we discuss your vision? I believe you're looking at a spring date. Something grand, I assume, to bridge the Ambrose and Summers estates? Everett sat down slowly, his movements stiff. His eyes were darting over Eddie, taking in the expensive watch, the confident posture, the coldness in his gaze. Yes, Colton took the lead, leaning back and crossing his legs. We want the wedding of the year. Budget isn't an issue. We just want perfection. Perfection is my specialty, Eddie said, his eyes finally shifting to Everett. Everett didn't say a word. He reached up, his fingers instinctively finding the thin silver chain beneath his dress shirt. He pulled at it, his thumb and forefinger catching on a hidden pendant. He began to fiddle with it, once, twice, 3 times. Eddie's stomach did a slow, painful flip. He's lying, Eddie thought. He's lying to his fiancée, he's lying to me, and he's probably lying to himself. I'll have Sarah bring in the initial contracts, Eddie said, his voice unwavering. If we're going to do this, we need to start immediately. My schedule is full for the next 18 months, but for the Ambrose family, I think I can find a way to fit you in. He looked Everett directly in the eye, offering a challenge. I've moved on, Everett. Have you? Everett let go of the necklace, a hollow, dry chuckle escaping his lips. I'm sure you can, Eddie. You were always very good at getting exactly what you wanted. The ink was barely dry on the intake form, but Eddie already knew, this was going to be the most beautiful disaster he had ever designed. Chapter 2, The Telltale Fidget. The office was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning and the scratching of Eddie's pen against a swatch of heavy cream silk. It had been 3 weeks since the initial consultation, and the Ambrose Summers merger, as the tabloids were calling it, was proving to be Eddie's most difficult project yet. Not because of the logistics, but because of the silence. The floral arrangements for the foyer need to be structural, Eddie said, not looking up from his sketches. Colton mentioned he liked minimalist lines, so I'm thinking white calla lilies and... The shrill ring of a smartphone interrupted him. Everett didn't even have to look at the screen to know who it was. He answered with a weary sigh. Colton? Are you near the gallery? We're waiting for you to approve the centerpieces. Everett went quiet, his face hardening into a polite, blank mask. From across the table, Eddie watched him. Even after a year apart, Eddie could read the subtle shifts in Everett's posture, the way his shoulders rose an inch, the way his jaw tightened. I understand, Everett said into the phone, his voice devoid of emotion. No, it's fine. The logistics meeting is important. Yes, I'll tell Eddie. Good night. The call ended. Everett set the phone face down on the mahogany table with a soft thud. He's not coming, Everett said, looking at the door as if he expected Colton to materialize anyway. A shipment from Singapore got held up at the docks. He has to oversee the rerouting personally. Eddie leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against his chin. He let a small, sharp smile touch his lips. You know, Everett, we have exactly 6 months until the most televised wedding in the country, and your husband-to-be seems significantly more interested in shipping containers than his own vows. Everett winced, the jab landing exactly where Eddie intended. Colton is dedicated to the family business, Eddie. You of all people should understand that. You built this entire firm on that kind of drive. I built this firm so I wouldn't have to answer to anyone, Eddie countered, his voice dropping an octave. Colton seems to be building a life where he doesn't have to show up. Everett didn't argue. Instead, he reached for a folder of catering menus, but his hand stopped halfway. He looked at Eddie, really looked at him, the overhead lights catching the exhaustion in the red-rimmed corners of his eyes. Can we just keep going? I want to oversee the entire process myself anyway. I don't want any surprises. Fine, Eddie said, turning a page on his tablet. The lighting. We need to decide on the warmth of the bulbs for the ballroom. If we go too yellow, the lilies look dingy. If we go too blue, the guests look like corpses. For the next 2 hours, they worked in a strange, concentrated bubble. This was how it used to be, the two of them, heads bent over a shared project, the rest of the world fading into the background. But back then, they were planning a future that belonged to them. Now, Eddie was helping the man he loved walk towards someone else. As the clock struck midnight, Eddie stood up to stretch. That's enough for tonight. You're starting to look like you're going to fall asleep in the samples. Everett stood as well, but he didn't head for the door. He walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights. Do you think I'm making a mistake? The question was so quiet Eddie almost missed it. He froze, his heart hammering a sudden, violent rhythm. This was the opening. This was the moment where he could say yes, you're throwing your life away. I think, Eddie said carefully, walking closer until he was standing just a few feet behind Everett, that you're doing exactly what you were raised to do. You're being a good son. You're being a good Ambrose. Everett turned around. The distance between them was dangerous. In the dim light of the office, the years seemed to peel away. Everett's hand drifted upward, his fingers catching the thin silver chain at his throat. Eddie watched him. His thumb and forefinger pinched the pendant. 1. Colton is a good man, Everett whispered. 2. This marriage is what's best for everyone involved. The stability, the legacy. 3. Everett's fingers let go of the chain, and he let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. Besides, I'm happy. Really. Eddie felt a surge of cold, familiar anger. He knew that laugh. He knew that fidget. It was the lie Everett told when he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. You're doing it again, Eddie said, his voice a low warning. Everett blinked, his hand dropping to his side. Doing what? Touching your necklace. Fiddling with the pendant 3 times. You only do that when you're lying through your teeth, Everett. The silence that followed was deafening. Everett's breath hitched, and for a second, the mask didn't just crack, it shattered. He looked at Eddie with a desperate, naked longing that made Eddie want to reach out and pull him into a kiss, or a fight, or both. I have to go, Everett said abruptly, grabbing his coat. Everett, wait. I'll see you at the cake tasting on Thursday, Eddie, Everett called over his shoulder, his footsteps echoing down the hall. Make sure they have the champagne filling Colton likes. Eddie stood alone in his office, the scent of Everett's expensive cologne lingering in the air. He looked down at the table, at the mountain of wedding plans they had built together. He knew Everett was lying. The problem was, Eddie didn't know if he was strong enough to keep playing along for another 6 months. Chapter 3, Shadows of the Past. The following Tuesday was meant to be a routine site visit to the historic Grand Pierre Ballroom. Instead, it became a slow descent into a past Eddie had tried desperately to bury. The morning air was crisp as Eddie waited by the curb in front of his studio. When the sleek black sedan pulled up, Colton was nowhere to be seen. The window rolled down, revealing Everett in the back seat, surrounded by a mountain of fabric samples and architectural blueprints. Colton had an emergency meeting at the port, Everett said before Eddie could even ask. His voice was flat, a rehearsed script he'd been reciting for weeks. Something about a lost manifest. He told us to go ahead without him. Eddie climbed in, the heavy scent of Everett's sandalwood cologne immediately filling his lungs. At this rate, Everett, I'm going to have to hire a body double for your groom just so we can check the sightlines for the altar. Everett didn't laugh. He just stared out the window as the car merged into the mid-morning traffic. He trusts my judgment. Or he's just not interested in anything that doesn't involve a shipping crane, Eddie muttered, pulling out his tablet. As they moved through the city, the professional itinerary began to dissolve. They spent an hour at the Grand Pierre, but Everett seemed distracted, his eyes trailing toward the smaller, more intimate garden annex rather than the gold-leafed ballroom Colton had insisted upon. You hate it, Eddie said, standing in the center of the cavernous room. Their footsteps echoed against the marble. I don't hate it, Everett replied, though he was looking at a gargoyle on the ceiling with a grimace. It's grand. It's appropriate. Appropriate is a terrible word for a wedding, Everett. Eddie walked closer, his leather shoes clicking sharply. You used to say that if you ever got married, you wanted it to feel like a secret. Not a press conference. Everett stiffened. People change, Eddie. Priorities shift. Clearly. By 1 p.m., the tension was a physical weight between them. When the car got stuck behind a delivery truck near the University District, Eddie looked out the window and felt a sharp pang of nostalgia. They were 3 blocks away from the Rusty Anchor, the Greasy Spoon diner where they had spent their college years sharing fries and dreaming of lives they hadn't yet outgrown. "I'm starving," Eddie announced, signaling the driver to pull over. "And if I have to look at another silk swatch before lunch, I'm going to lose my mind." Everett looked at the diner, his eyes widening. "Eddie, we have a schedule. We're supposed to meet the florist at 2. The florist can wait. I'm the one they're paying, I decide when we're late." Inside the diner, the air smelled of burnt coffee and deep fryer oil. It was a jarring contrast to the 5-star world they had spent the morning navigating. They slid into a vinyl booth in the back corner, the same booth where, 4 years ago, Everett had promised Eddie that no matter how big the Ambrose empire got, he would never let it come between them. The silence over their burgers was heavy, but not cold. It was the silence of 2 people who had too much to say and no safe way to say it. "Colton wants the centerpieces to be 3 feet tall," Everett said, breaking the quiet. He was picking at his fries. "He says height equals prestige." Eddie snorted. "Height equals people not being able to see the person sitting across from them. It's a wedding, not a hedge maze." Everett looked up, a genuine, small smile finally breaking through his mask. "That's exactly what I told him. He told me I didn't understand the visual language of power." "He sounds delightful," Eddie remarked dryly. "Tell me, Everett. In this visual language of power, is there any room for what you want? Because so far, every choice we've made in the last 3 weeks has been for the Summers logo, not the Ambrose groom." Everett's smile vanished. He reached for the silver chain around his neck, his fingers twitching. "Don't," Eddie whispered, reaching across the table. He didn't touch Everett's hand, but the proximity made the air hum. "Don't tell me you am happy. Don't do the tell, Everett. Not here. Not in this booth." Everett's hand froze. He looked at Eddie, his eyes raw and suddenly very young. "It's only been 6 months, Eddie. Since I met him. My parents, they were so relieved. The stock prices stabilized. The merger meant we wouldn't have to sell off the maritime division." "You sold yourself to save a division?" Eddie's voice was laced with a bitterness he couldn't hide. "I worked my ass off to become someone who couldn't be ignored, Everett. I thought if I became successful enough, your family wouldn't see me as a distraction. And now I'm standing here, planning a wedding for a man who doesn't even know your favorite color is sage green, not summer's gold." Everett flinched as if Eddie had struck him. He looked down at the table, his voice a broken whisper. "He thinks I like gold." "I know," Eddie said, leaning back, the victory feeling like ashes in his mouth. As they left the diner and walked back to the car, a sudden downpour began, a typical city flash flood. They dashed for the sedan, laughing breathlessly as they ducked inside, soaked to the bone. For a moment, as they huddled in the back seat, shoulders brushing, the cold professional wall was gone. Everett was looking at Eddie, his hair damp and stuck to his forehead, and for a heartbeat, the wedding of the year felt like a distant, bad dream. "We're late for the florist," Everett breathed, his gaze dropping to Eddie's lips. "Let them wait," Eddie replied, his heart hammering against his ribs. But the moment snapped. Everett pulled away, smoothing his wet hair and staring straight ahead. The mask was back, but it was crooked. "Drive," Everett told the chauffeur. As the car pulled away, Eddie looked at the sketches on his tablet. He realized with a sinking heart that he wasn't just planning a wedding anymore. He was documenting a slow-motion car crash, and he was the one holding the camera. Chapter 4, The Altar of Truth. The morning of the wedding was a masterpiece of orchestrated chaos. For 6 months, Eddie had lived in a world of floral counts, seating charts, and the lingering scent of Everett's sandalwood cologne. He had watched the man he loved settle for appropriate over and over again. Now, standing at the back of the Grand Pierre ballroom with a headset clamped to his ear, Eddie was the conductor of a symphony he wished he'd never written. Cues in 30 seconds, Eddie whispered into his mic, "String quartet, stand by. Security, clear the west aisle." The ballroom was a sea of Summers gold and ivory, a high-gloss, expensive spectacle that looked more like a corporate gala than a union of souls. At the front of the room, standing before an arch of white calla lilies that looked like frozen tears, was Everett. He looked devastating. His suit was a midnight navy that made his eyes look hauntingly dark. From this distance, he looked like a statue of a prince. But Eddie, watching through a pair of high-end binoculars from the tech booth, saw the truth. Everett's right hand was tucked behind his back, his fingers rhythmically twitching against the fabric of his trousers. He was searching for a necklace that wasn't there. His mother had made him take it off for the cleaner aesthetic of the wedding photos. "Groom is moving," Sarah's voice crackled in Eddie's ear. The doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Colton Summers stepped into the light. He looked every bit the powerhouse heir, his stride confident, his smile radiant for the cameras that lined the back of the room. He walked down the aisle not like a man meeting his partner, but like a conqueror claiming a territory. He didn't look at Everett with longing, he looked at the crowd with triumph. As Colton reached the altar, the music swelled and then dipped into a reverent hush. The priest began the ancient liturgy of the Ambrose and Summers families. Eddie stood in the shadows, his hands gripped so tightly on the railing that his knuckles were white. "If there is anyone here who knows of any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony," the priest intoned, his voice echoing off the gold-leafed ceiling, "let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was the standard, heavy pause of a high-society wedding. Eddie closed his eyes, bracing for the inevitable "I do." Then, the sound of a chair scraping against marble cut through the silence like a gunshot. In the third row, a woman stood up. She wasn't dressed in the prescribed gold or ivory, she wore a simple, dark maternity dress that clung to a very prominent, 8-month-old swell at her midsection. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on Colton with a mixture of terror and fury. "I object," she said. Her voice was small, but in the hushed ballroom, it carried to every corner. Colton didn't turn around immediately. He froze, his jaw tightening. Everett, however, looked at her with a confused, growing horror. "Colton," the woman said, stepping into the aisle. "You told me the wedding was a business arrangement. You told me you would take care of us. But you stopped answering my calls 3 weeks ago." The room erupted into a low, frantic murmur. The wedding of the century was dissolving into the scandal of the decade. "Security," Colton hissed, his face turning a mottled red. "Get this woman out of here. She's a lunatic." "I'm not a lunatic," she cried out, her voice breaking. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a sonogram. "We've been together for 8 months, Colton. You know this is yours. You just didn't want the Ambrose family to find out before the merger went through." Eddie watched from the shadows, his heart stopping. 8 months. The math hit the room like a physical blow. Colton and Everett had only been dating for 6. The timeline was a jagged glass shards of betrayal. Colton hadn't just been busy with shipping containers, he had been maintaining a secret life while using Everett as a stepping stone to a maritime empire. Everett took a step back from the altar. He looked at Colton, the man he had sacrificed his happiness for, the man his parents had praised as a stable partner. "Everett, let's just go into the side room and handle this," Colton said, reaching for Everett's arm, his voice low and commanding. "It's just a payoff issue. I'll handle the girl. We can still finish the ceremony." Everett looked at Colton's hand as if it were a venomous snake. Then, he looked at the woman in the aisle, whose tears were now flowing freely. "A payoff?" Everett's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. "You've been seeing her since before we even met. You were using her, and you were using me. It's business, Everett. Don't be naive, Colton snapped, his mask finally dropping to reveal the cold, calculating man underneath. Everett didn't scream. He didn't cause a scene. He simply reached up, unpinned the gold Summers Ambrose crest from his lapel, and let it fall to the marble floor. The clink of the metal was the loudest sound in the room. "The wedding is over," Everett said to the room, his voice surprisingly steady. He turned and walked off the altar, heading not for the side room, not for his parents, and not for the cameras. He walked straight toward the back of the hall, toward the shadows where Eddie was standing. For a second, their eyes met, the wedding planner and the man who was no longer a groom. Everett's eyes were shattered, red-rimmed and hollow, but in the depths of them, Eddie saw a flicker of the boy from the diner. Everett didn't stop. He pushed through the heavy oak doors and disappeared into the afternoon sun, leaving behind a ballroom full of gasping elites and a wedding that had become a crime scene. Eddie stood in the silence of the booth, his headset still crackling with Sarah's panicked voice. He looked down at the floor plan of the perfect day, and slowly, methodically, tore it in half. Chapter 5: The Cleanup Crew. The silence in Everett's penthouse was heavier than the noise of the scandal outside. It had been 2 weeks since the altar of truth, and while the tabloids were still feasting on Colton's infidelities, the Ambrose family had gone into a defensive crouch. Eddie stood at the heavy mahogany door, a keycard clutched in his hand. Everett's parents had been the ones to give it to him. They had looked aged, their polished veneer cracked by the realization that their pursuit of convenience had nearly destroyed their only son. "He won't answer our calls," his mother had whispered, her eyes red. "But he might answer yours." Eddie swiped the card. The door hissed open. The air inside was stale, smelling of expensive scotch and the metallic tang of neglect. The floor was a minefield of shattered crystal and discarded newspapers with headlines that made Eddie's stomach turn. "Everett?" There was no answer. Eddie moved through the living room, his heart sinking. He found Everett on the floor of the glass-walled balcony, slumped against the railing. The city lights of the skyline mocked him with their glitter. Everett was still wearing the trousers from the wedding, though his shirt was unbuttoned and stained. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, staring at a bottle of Macallan that was 3/4 empty. "Go away, Eddie," Everett croaked, his voice like gravel. "I'm sure you have a failure to launch fee in your contract. Just send the invoice." Eddie didn't go away. He set his bag down and began to move, his wedding planner instincts kicking in, not for a ceremony, but for a person. He gathered the empty bottles, stacked the papers face down, and opened a window to let the cold night air flush out the gloom. "I'm not here for an invoice," Eddie said, his voice firm but quiet. He walked over and sat on the floor a few feet away from Everett, not crowding him. "I'm here because your kitchen is a disaster and you look like you haven't eaten anything that didn't come out of a distillery in 14 days. Everett let out a jagged, bitter laugh. "My parents sent you, didn't they? The great Eddie Morris, back to fix the one mess he couldn't plan for. They're worried, Everett. And for once, it's not about the stock price." Everett finally turned his head, his gaze dragging across Eddie's face. "Why did you stay? That day at the altar, you could have just walked away with your reputation intact. Instead, you're here, cleaning up my filth." Eddie reached out, tentatively placing a hand on Everett's knee. "Because I've been cleaning up after you since we were 20, Everett. And because I know you. I know why you really did it." The mention of the past broke something. Everett's composure crumbled, his shoulders shaking as he pulled his knees to his chest. "I never wanted to leave you, Eddie. That morning at the diner, a year ago, my father had photos of us. He told me that if I didn't marry into a logistics power, he'd make sure no venue in the country would ever take a booking from you. He said he'd bury your name before you even had a chance to build it." Eddie froze. He had always assumed Everett had just chosen the easy path of wealth. He had never realized he was the bargaining chip. "You broke my heart to save my career?" I was a coward, Everett sobbed, the words tumbling out in a rush of grief. I thought I could handle Colton. I thought if I followed the script, I could keep you safe from my family. But Colton he was a monster. And I was so desperate to be a good son that I didn't see the woman, the child, any of it. Eddie moved then, closing the gap and pulling Everett into his arms. It wasn't the polished, professional embrace of a consultant, it was the desperate, grounding hold of the boy who had once shared fries in a vinyl booth. Everett buried his face in Eddie's shoulder, his fingers clutching at Eddie's coat as he finally broke down. He wept for the year they had lost, for the humiliation of the wedding, and for the weight of the silver chain he had been tugging at for 6 months. "It's over," Eddie whispered into his hair, his own eyes stinging. "The merger is dead. Colton is gone. And I'm still here. I ruined everything," Everett gasped against his neck. "No," Eddie said, pulling back just enough to look him in the eye. "You just had a very public dress rehearsal. Now, we're going to get you into a shower, I'm going to make you some toast, and then we're going to figure out how to write a better script." For the first time in weeks, Everett didn't reach for the necklace. He reached for Eddie's hand, his grip weak but certain. The penthouse was still a mess, and the world outside was still waiting to judge them, but in the quiet of the balcony, the wedding of the century was finally, mercifully, behind them. Chapter 6: The Intruder. The smell of burnt toast and lemon-scented floor cleaner had just begun to mask the stench of stale scotch when the elevator chattered to life. Eddie was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, rinsing the last of the crystal shards from the sink. Everett sat at the breakfast bar, wrapped in a heavy robe, his hair still damp from the shower Eddie had practically forced him into. For the first time in a fortnight, there was a faint hint of color in Everett's cheeks. The elevator doors slid open with a sharp ding, and the peace was shattered. Colton Summers stormed into the penthouse, his silk tie crooked and his eyes bloodshot with a different kind of intensity, fury. He looked like a man who had been losing a war of public relations for 14 days straight and had finally found someone to hit. "You," Colton spat, pointing a trembling finger at Everett. "You think you can just walk away? My lawyers are drowning in breach of contract filings from the vendors, and the press is camped outside my parents' estate like vultures." Everett didn't flinch. He set his coffee cup down with a steady hand. "Get out, Colton. You're trespassing." "I'm trespassing? We had a signed merger, Everett. We had a future." Colton's gaze shifted, landing on Eddie, who had stepped out of the kitchen, a dish towel still draped over his shoulder. Colton's lip curled in disgust. "And you? I should have known. The help is still here, playing nursemaid." "What is it, Eddie? Is he paying you an hourly rate to hold his hand, or are you hoping for a tip?" "Colton, leave. Now," Eddie said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. "Or what? You'll rearrange my centerpiece?" Colton lunged forward, bypassing the breakfast bar. He grabbed Everett by the lapels of his robe, hauling him upward. "You ruined my family's name over a girl. You humiliated me in front of the entire country for some moral high ground you don't even possess." "I didn't ruin your name, Colton," Everett said, his voice remarkably calm even as his feet struggled for purchase. "You did that the moment you decided people were assets to be managed instead of human beings." Colton's face contorted. He raised a fist, the polished Summers signet ring glinting in the morning light. "You ungrateful little." Before the blow could land, Eddie moved. He wasn't a fighter by trade, but years of managing high-stress events had given him a certain level of physical decisiveness. He stepped in, catching Colton's wrist in midair and shoving his shoulder into the taller man's chest. "I said," Eddie hissed, his face inches from Colton's, "get out." Colton stumbled back, shocked by the resistance. He looked at Eddie, then at Everett, who was now standing tall, no longer the broken man from the balcony. The realization finally hit Colton, the power dynamic had shifted. He wasn't the conqueror anymore, he was the intruder. "You're pathetic," Colton screamed, his voice cracking as he backed toward the elevator. Both of you. You think the wedding planner is going to save you? You're a joke, Everett. Without the Summers name, you're just a CEO of a sinking ship. Then let it sink, Everett called out, his voice ringing through the cavernous room. At least I'll be the one steering it. Colton lashed out one last time, kicking a designer floor lamp and sending it crashing against the marble before the elevator doors finally hissed shut, cutting off his frantic shouting. The silence that followed was ringing. Eddie let out a long, shaky breath, his heart thudding against his ribs. He looked at his hands, they were trembling. You're a better bodyguard than a planner, Everett said softly. Eddie turned, seeing Everett watching him with an expression that was no longer shattered. It was filled with a terrifyingly clear clarity. He's right about one thing, Eddie said, wiping his palms on his trousers. The press isn't going to let this go. And your parents' estate is going to be a circus. You can't stay here, Everett. He has the key code, and the security downstairs clearly isn't enough to stop a Summers with a grudge. Everett looked around the cold, glass-walled penthouse, a place that had never felt like a home, only a cage. Where am I supposed to go? Every hotel in the city is a trap. Eddie reached into his pocket and pulled out his own keys. He thought of the small, quiet house in the suburbs he'd bought 6 months ago, the one with the white fence and the garden he never had time to tend to. The one Everett didn't know about yet. I have a guest room, Eddie said. It's quiet. No cameras. No marble. Just a neighborhood where nobody cares about maritime mergers. Everett looked at the keys, then up at Eddie. You'd really take me in? After everything? I'm a wedding planner, Everett, Eddie said with a small, tired smile. I specialize in the for better or for worse part. Even if the wedding never actually happened. Chapter 7, The Dream Home in the Suburbs. The drive to the suburbs was a blur of highway lights and heavy, contemplative silence. As the city's jagged skyline gave way to the soft, rolling silhouettes of oak trees and manicured lawns, the tension that had held Everett's shoulders rigid for weeks finally began to slacken. Eddie pulled the car into a gravel driveway in front of a modest, 2-story craftsman house. It was painted a soft, muted sage, a color that felt like a deep breath. We're here, Eddie said, cutting the engine. Everett stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching on the gravel. He stood frozen on the walkway, staring at the porch. There was a swing chair on the left, a cluster of potted ferns on the right, and a warm, amber glow spilling from the windows. Eddie, Everett whispered, his voice thick. This house, the wraparound porch. The stone chimney. The way the roofline dips over the front door. He turned to Eddie, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp memory. This is it. This is the house we talked about during finals week in senior year. The one you said you saw in a magazine and promised yourself you'd find one day. Eddie felt a flush creep up his neck. He busied himself with the luggage in the trunk. I remembered you liked the layout. When it hit the market last year, I just knew I had to buy it. Even if I was living here alone. Inside, the house didn't smell like lemon cleaner and desperation. It smelled of cedarwood, old books, and the faint, lingering scent of the tea Eddie had brewed that morning. There were no marble floors to echo their mistakes, only hardwood and soft wool rugs. The guest room is at the top of the stairs, Eddie said, gesturing. It's got a view of the garden. It's quiet, Everett. No sirens. No paparazzi. Everett didn't go upstairs. Instead, he wandered into the kitchen, running his hand along the butcher block countertop. He looked like a man who had been underwater for a year and was finally breaking the surface. I thought I'd lost this, Everett said, looking back at Eddie. Not just the dream of the house, but the person who remembered it. My life in the city, it was all spreadsheets and visual languages of power. I forgot that things could just be quiet. Eddie moved into the kitchen, leaning against the counter. You didn't lose it. You just put it in a box and let your father hide the key. But Colton is gone, and your parents are currently too busy apologizing to the press to tell you what to do. The key is back in your hand, Everett. They spent the night in the living room, curled on a sofa that was actually comfortable, not the stiff, designer pieces from the penthouse. They talked about everything and nothing, the local bakery Eddie frequented, the way the neighbor's dog always barked at the mailman, and the projects Eddie wanted to take on now that the wedding of the century was off his plate. I'm going to resign as CEO, Everett said suddenly, staring into the fireplace. Eddie paused, a blanket halfway over his lap. Everett, you don't have to. No, I do. I want to lead a division, maybe something smaller. Something I actually care about. But I'm done being the face of a legacy that doesn't belong to me. He looked at Eddie, a small, tired smile touching his lips. I want to be the kind of man who actually shows up for dinner. The kind of man who knows the difference between silk and synthetic because he's actually listening when his partner speaks. The word partner hung in the air, sweet and heavy. Eddie reached out, his hand finding Everett's on the cushion between them. You've been a good son for 26 years, Everett, Eddie said, his thumb grazing Everett's knuckles. Try being a happy man for a change. I think it suits you better. Everett leaned over, resting his forehead against Eddie's. The air in the suburban house was still, protected by the tight security and the even tighter bond they were weaving back together. Stay with me? Everett breathed. In the guest room. Just for tonight. The guest room has a very small bed, Everett, Eddie teased, his voice low and warm. Then we'll just have to be very close, Everett replied. For the first time in a year, Eddie Morris didn't have a plan. He didn't have a schedule, a floor plan, or a contingency. He just had the man he'd never stopped loving, in a house that was no longer just a dream. Chapter 8, The New Contract. 6 months had passed since the suburban house had become a sanctuary, and the world had finally stopped screaming. The scandal of the Ambrose Summers merger had faded into a cautionary tale for the elite, replaced by newer, fresher dramas. Colton Summers had retreated to an overseas branch of his family's company, shadowed by legal battles and child support hearings, while the Ambrose family had learned a hard lesson in the value of their son's silence. Eddie stood in his studio, but the atmosphere was different now. The organized chaos was still there, but the frantic, cold edge was gone. He was no longer the man trying to prove his worth through the sheer scale of his events. He was choosing his clients carefully, people who actually looked at each other during consultations. The bell above the door chimed, and Eddie didn't need to look up to know the rhythm of the footsteps. The catering for the Grayson Gala is finalized, Everett said, leaning against the doorframe of Eddie's office. He looked healthier, the sharp, defensive lines of his face softened by a life lived in the sun. He had stepped down as CEO, taking over a smaller, boutique investment arm of the family business that allowed him to be home by 6. But I think the florist is overcharging for the peonies. Eddie looked up, a playful glint in his eyes. Oh? And since when did the former head of Ambrose Holdings become an expert on floral markups? Since I started dating the best wedding planner in the country, Everett said, walking into the room and dropping a kiss on Eddie's forehead. I've picked up a few things. Mostly that you're a softie for a good centerpiece. Everett sat in the velvet chair, the same one he had sat in 6 months ago when he was a ghost of himself. Now, he reached out and took Eddie's hand, his thumb tracing the palm. There was no silver chain around his neck anymore. He didn't need a tell, because he no longer had anything to hide. My parents want us for dinner on Sunday, Everett mentioned, his voice casual. They've finally stopped asking about the merger. My mother actually asked about your business expansion. I think she's trying to audition for the role of supportive mother-in-law. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, Eddie laughed, though the idea didn't feel as impossible as it once had. But Sunday works. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the mood boards and fabric swatches, Everett stood up and began to help Eddie pack his bag. He moved with a sense of belonging that still made Eddie's heart skip. "Actually," Everett said, his voice dropping into a more serious tone. He stopped by Eddie's desk, his hand hovering over a small drawer he knew Eddie kept locked. "I was thinking about the fall. Your schedule is usually lighter then, isn't it?" "A bit." "Why?" Everett pulled a small, navy blue velvet box from his pocket. He didn't open it yet, he just let it rest in the palm of his hand, the light catching the silver embossed crest on the lid. "Because I think it's time you stopped planning everyone else's happily ever after and started working on our own. No press. No logistics empires. Just a house in the suburbs and a garden that needs tending." Eddie froze, his breath catching in his throat. He looked from the box to Everett's eyes, which were clear, steady, and full of a love that had survived the wreckage of 1,000 bad decisions. "Is that a professional request, Mr. Ambrose?" Eddie whispered, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "It's a personal one, Eddie," Everett replied, stepping closer until their chests were touching. "I've already checked the planner's schedule. He's free for the rest of his life." Eddie reached out, his fingers brushing the velvet of the box. He didn't need to see the ring to know it was perfect. He knew the person who had chosen it, and for the first time in his career, Eddie Morris didn't care about the decor, the lighting, or the visual language of power. He just cared about the man standing in front of him. "I think I can fit you in," Eddie breathed, pulling Everett down for a kiss that tasted like the future. The wedding of the century had been a disaster, but the wedding of their lives was finally, beautifully, in the works. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. See you in the next story.